Welcome everyone to our last and final ATAR support analysis desk, where I'm joined here with Checkers and our resident expert FLC. We're going to run through what went wrong and what went right in the semi-finals against Melbourne, Maelstrom, and Brisbane Boom, and then transition that into what the preview is for the grand final and how that is going to roll out and what are the key win conditions for that game. So welcome FLC. What do you got for us? Owsy, I don't think they can hear you in stream.
Press the wrong button to unmute. Okay, it's okay. I got it.
FLC is now back.
I'm
he
here.
gave me and Checkers the best rundown intro, but hasn't said anything to you guys.
Yeah, sorry. No, I like when I set up OBS, it like duplicated the mic and desktop audio thing. And so one of them works and the other one doesn't, and I unmuted the one that doesn't work. Okay, we're all good now, though. So we've just had Brisbane versus Melbourne, and it was a fairly one-sided affair, at least in terms of the games that mattered. Yes, it was eventually a 2-1, because we did play out the entire 9-game set, but in terms of the games that mattered, it was 4-1 in favour of Brisbane, and 2 sets to 0. And pretty much it was a case of I think there were a couple of things that Melbourne specifically I don't even want to say did wrong. It's not that Melbourne did things incorrectly. It was more that Melbourne has some more fundamental or had some more fundamental things that they needed to address that I actually think would that the players on Melbourne should consider for, like, we've got the Oceanic League coming up. It's not just a matter of like how Melbourne went wrong, but how these players need to potentially shift the way they think about the game. So with Brisbane, we also saw a little bit of sort of a continuation of what we were discussing last week. We were a bit concerned last week about, okay, well, how much of what Brisbane's doing is actually going to translate over to this set, because Brisbane hasn't been playing with their with this lineup, this specific lineup, for the most part in the last couple of weeks. And we were sort of thinking, okay, well, is it just going to be the same thing but better? What's going to happen with Brisbane? And sure enough, we have a few slight differences with the way Brisbane's been playing, but also a lot of things staying very much the same and ending up just being sort of more bit better. So we're going to jump right into it. We're going to go through all of the first 5 games of this set. We're not going to talk about the final Clan Blitz game or the Rainmaker set, just because, for me personally, like, even if those games might be interesting, it's a bit difficult to sort of analyze them with the idea that they might not necessarily be as, I guess, serious as the others. Like, I don't think the teams are even memeing. It's just that there's a very distinct difference between a set, like the mentality coming into a set when everything's on the line versus once things have sort of already played out and you're just playing, going through the motions.
Right. So I tend to agree with you there.
Yeah. So it's
100%.
Like, just even looking at the weapon choices, we can actually see a bit of that straight away. So we've got, for Melbourne, we've got Goose and Shockwave. Goose, Goy, and Psy as sort of, we mentioned last week, they have a 3-1 with Shock being the 1 and Goose, and then the rest of Melbourne sort of comprising the 3. And I also mentioned last week that Goose, I think, is a key part of Melbourne's strategy, because he's sort of the only player on that team who really plays those sort of close range, slayery kind of weapons. Now, what I also said was I think that Goose playing Carbon is going to be a crucial part of this set, and unfortunately we didn't even get to see him playing Carbon until after the set had already been decided. And I think that we also saw later on in this set that Shock brought out the Kenza Pro, instead of the Nautilus, where we'd normally expect him to play Nautilus. He instead played K-Pro. I looked at that, and what I thought was that I think these guys were afraid of picking something that wasn't proven, even if it was the better choice. I think that this would have been a hell of a lot closer of a set if you had Shock picking Nort and Goose picking Carbon, and especially like I look at TC. TC is like the best mode for Carbon Roller. It's the mode where Carbon Roller is at its strongest. And yet we didn't have Goose playing Carbon in TC at all. And it was only after things were all over and done with that he even picked the Carbon at all. And maybe he's just not comfortable with it on. I can't imagine how he wouldn't be comfortable on with Carbon on TC. It doesn't make any sense to me that he wouldn't be comfortable with it. I don't know why Shock picked K-Pro. I'm sure there might be a really good reason for it. But to me, seeing these two weapons on these two key players that were not the weapons that define what makes them a key player seemed like almost, I don't want to say capitulation. It wasn't as though they were throwing it. It seemed as though they were just trying to play too safely and not taking enough responsibility for what needed to happen in the sets. They weren't taking enough responsibility for to win the actual set. Whereas Brisbane, on one hand, you could say they don't have this problem. And on the other hand, when has Neru not picked Remix? You know, there's plenty of maps where Ballpoint is the better splatling, you know, so to speak. But Neru still plays Remix. There are a lot of maps where Dynamo and Explorer aren't really the best choices. We've had one of them, Port Mackerel. We discussed that a couple of weeks ago. How Murray on Port Mackerel still picks Dynamo. Even though Dynamo on Port Mackerel, he probably doesn't like the map very much. He probably doesn't like playing Dynamo on that map very much, but he still plays it because playing Dynamo is more important to his results than playing a weapon that is good on Port Mackerel, right? And it's the same thing with Shock and Goose. I think they needed to pick and be more willing to pick stuff like Carbon Roller and Nautilus. Especially Nautilus, right? Like Carbon Roller, yes, you could argue that maybe it doesn't fit in with the comp, but the Nautilus especially, I think we needed to see that. And I also, that's basically what I think. I don't want to be too harsh, but that kind of like not being willing to pick. It seems so. It might seem kind of almost petty to say that like you should have picked Carbon Roller, especially after the fact. But to not pick a weapon that is sort of that defines who you are in the game, just because maybe the weapon isn't considered to be as strong as some others, it's like that to me just seems like a lack of conviction, a lack of decisiveness that is required to win these sets, win these tournaments.
Yeah.
Whereas Brisbane definitely did not lack that because they've stuck to their identity the entire time. I'm sort of talking about this stuff very generally because unfortunately the first map here is Skipper Pavilion, and most of the game takes place behind the scorecard, so it's a little bit difficult to analyze exactly what's going on here. But we can still do our best.
Okay, there seems to be a phenomenon that I've noticed in my, experience in esports, and where especially in high pressure situations before the game's going into it, you're thinking about your strategies. Like everyone wants to pull out this shadow jutsu, this trap card, this something that no one knows, this unexpected thing that's going to give them the win, right?
Yeah.
Rather than sticking to what they know they're good at, what they can play, and what they can do, in an attempt to, I don't know, catch the enemy off guard or something like that. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but I definitely think in high pressure situations where I've got to give everything. It is very commonplace in Splatoon to say, yep, the gun is the thing that needs to change. Not my mindset, not the way I approach objective, but the gun needs to change because that's the simplest thing to fix.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree with that. Like, it's a common thing, and I think what you're referring to is part of a greater kind of insecurity that it's very easy to feel
Hmm.
insecure about your choices in a game like this
Hmm.
because like let's say you decide between at the weapon select screen, and this is why it's weapons a lot of the time. It's because it's a very distinct choice that you make on the weapon select screen. Do I pick Nautilus or do I pick K-Pro? Do I pick Carbon? Do I pick T-Tech? Do I pick
Hmm.
Remix? Do I pick Ballpoint? Right? And if you pick the weapon that other people have shown to work, there's a sort of security rather in that, where
Yeah.
if you are wrong, or if it turns out to not be the right choice, at least you weren't wrong in making that choice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And whereas if you say pick the carbon roller and it doesn't work out, then it's very tempting. It feels really bad because now you've made this choice that you could very easily argue has led to a loss.
Yep, and it's very clear that this was the bad weapon choice because it's not a top tier meta pick or what
Yes,
other people have done.
it
Yeah, okay,
feels
I
that
get you.
way.
Yep.
It's not even that it was a bad idea. It's just that it feels that way,
Yes, yes. Okay, yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So and what I'm saying, so I said before that you need conviction and decisiveness, and you need to take responsibility for your weapon choices here. I think that for example, Silaris, like, she's been playing a lot of Range Blaster, and you could very easily say, well, you don't have to pick Range Blaster. You could pick other stuff. You could pick Custom Blaster. You could pick Kenza. Kenza. Actually, she does play K Rapid, but like, it's not that you just have to. Like, but at the same time, there is something to be said for the fact that she does stick with the weapons that she's good at.
Mm-hmm.
At least, in terms of she's been playing a lot of Range Blaster lately. Yes, she has been a good anchor player in the past, but right now she's playing blasters and she sticks with that. Um, and so to me, what I see in Melbourne and what I don't see in Brisbane is that Melbourne lacks a lot of Melbourne's players, and especially their key players in Shock and maybe Goose. I don't know how much. Like, I don't know whether Shock told Goose not to pick Carbon or if Goose just decided not to pick Carbon. But either way, those two players needed to have more confidence and and take more responsibility for their own choices in this game. Now, I'm saying this is a game that Melbourne won, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
and we're just kind of going through it to the point that I wanted to talk about with respect to how Melbourne actually won this game, because there's a lot of sort of conceptual stuff as to why this map isn't great for Brisbane, but what I want to highlight is the when you are faced with a choice between picking what other people have shown to work versus picking what would be best for you, is responsibility. That is the key thing. You're taking responsibility for the outcome of the game, and you're saying, I believe, and this is the conviction, right? I believe that this is the right choice for this map, right? Not,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I could pick T-Tech instead of Carbon. T-Tech is the safer pick, but I
Mm-hmm.
believe that Carbon makes more sense.
Yep.
Therefore, I'm going to pick Carbon, and even though I could lose because of this choice, but I'm going to take responsibility for that. I'm going to accept the fact that, firstly, this is a tournament set. You're allowed to lose games, not too many,
Yes.
just a couple. You're allowed to, like, especially in this first game, I should see a Carbon and a Nautilus. Maybe not a Nautilus with the comp that they have, but I should at least see a Carbon on this, right? And I mean, you could even argue that this is actually the exact right comp. But the point is more that, like, through the entire set we didn't see it, not just this first game. But what I what I'm not seeing here, so it's there's this lack of willingness to be responsible for the outcome of the game, to actually say to yourself, okay, look, I'm going to pick this weapon because this works for me and it works for my team. And this is something that I think is it's a I don't want to be too dramatic, but it's a bit of a plague in the competitive scene. This
Mm-hmm.
idea that you have to pick things that are good, right? Weapons that
Yeah,
are
right.
good.
Right. That's an age-old argument, isn't it?
So to me, like when I'm thinking about the game, I don't think about the game in terms of what's good. I never think about the game in terms of what's good. I think about the game in terms of what something can accomplish, right? The tools that are available to me and what those tools do. That's the only thing that I don't think about. Like, I don't try to judge these tools. I try to think about them in terms of, or at least not in terms of like one is better than the other. I think about them in terms of, okay, well, if I've got a T-Tech, it can paint fairly quickly. It shoots, 3 shots a kill, fairly quick at doing so, fairly accurate, not laser accurate like a splash rather, but not, not like a junior either. Like this is what a T-Tech is. It's not a good weapon. It's not a bad weapon, right? Carbon is not a good weapon or a bad weapon. It is a carbon roller, and
Hmm.
I think that the reason I'm making this point is because this kind of idea of what is good and what is bad is what to me underpins this insecurity,
Hmm.
right? Where if you pick a good weapon and fail, at least the choice of I picked a like at least the choice isn't something that's going to make you feel bad, right? The choice of picking a good weapon, it's a good weapon, like it's meta, I can pick this weapon and it's fine, um, and you feel confident based on the fact that you've picked this weapon, and then maybe the weapon doesn't work out, but at least you made the right choice, And if you made the right choice in weapon select, then obviously there's nothing else you could have done. It's your teammate's fault, right? We've all played solo queue. Like this, like the idea that something is good, therefore you should use it, is one of the worst things you can do to yourself as a player. Is to let yourself fall into that trap. What you need to be thinking about is whether something will win you the game, right? And we look at this comp that Brisbane's been running. Brisbane has been running Dynamo Remix this entire time, right? Remix is not that great of a weapon. Dynamo is not that great of a weapon. Two T-Techs is like, where's your armor? You got armor on a Dynamo, right? Dynamo is not really an armor spamming weapon, but it works for Brisbane, right? They win games. They're in the finals. Melbourne
Hmm.
has in fairness, they aren't ostensibly a meta team because they do have the range blaster, but I mean, Zap, T-Tech, and Slosher is pretty meta, pretty straightforward. It's not like you've got a lot of good weapons in Melbourne's comp, and you've got a lot of average weapons in Brisbane's, and yet Brisbane's comp makes a lot more sense. Brisbane's comp will win more games. And again, I'm saying this like we're getting to the point that I want to talk about this. This game, like, well, I feel like I'm ranting partly because I am, but it's like
I feel
this.
like I'm ranting because I'm ranting.
I said partly. It's just like it it's really frustrating to watch, right?
Right.
Because we were looking at this stuff last week, and we were saying, okay, this is what Brisbane does, this is what Melbourne does, this is what Sydney does. Brisbane has stuck to what they do, and they've come out the better for it. Melbourne
Mm.
has changed things. Okay,
Hmm.
we've already spoken about one of the changes they've made, which is they've stopped using certain weapons. The other one, and you guys mentioned this on the broadcast, is this. All right, so Goose has taken Shock's place in this game as sort of the flanking player. All right, now I don't know. This stopped happening a little bit after Shock switched back over to K Pro, but what we mentioned last week was that Melbourne does a 3-1 strategy. Now, the 3-1 that Melbourne does is kind of a response to just this is like the way their team the way their team naturally plays is to be in sort of a 3-1 thing. Shock, especially playing as much solo queue as he does, has developed this kind of independent mentality where he'll play away from his team with weapons that can very easily rack up multiple kills or just swing the game, whatever. Whereas a lot of these other players are used to playing with a team, right? So like you get a lot of players who aren't really solo queue connoisseurs, shall we say. And so they're going to stick together. And on top of that, the weapons that they pick also need to stay together. Slosher is an assist weapon. Blaster is, especially range blaster, is an assist weapon. Goose is the kind of player who will play off aggression. So when someone goes in from the enemy team on one of Goose's teammates, he will be the one who is, sharking in a corner or whatever, and shoots them in the back, right? So he's playing off his team. Whereas Shock is quite often playing independent of his team, using what his team is doing to gain a positional advantage. And there is a spot, actually, I think we're gonna actually back up a little bit here, because this was a bit more obvious. I think this was it here. Okay. So, for example, in this situation, I believe, so we see Goose here. What Goose is about to do is he's basically going to run in here and try to get a flank on top of the 4 players that Brisbane have sort of stacked up here. He does this a couple of times through the game. I think this is just the most sort of obvious point. Now, I think in this situation, I believe Shock would go like so, right? He would actually go into this part of the map. The reason is because on this map, if you think about the way it's laid out, there is actually no way to cross this line, which you need to do, by the way, if you want to push the tower. If the tower is not actually here to push you up, you have to ride the tower up here, or you have to go through this slick. Right?
The worst flank in the game. Out of every map in the game,
yes.
I think that is the worst.
It's awful, right? Because if they're up here, you just get spotted every single time.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I think if Shock were in this position, he would know there's 4 people here, which means this is completely open and we need to take control of this. So quite often what we'll see is when Shock goes on a flank, and this is especially true when he escapes behind the enemy team, he'll sort of go up here and he'll just paint this, right? He won't actually try to fight these guys, he'll just paint this. And then he'll sort of put himself, say, up here, so that if the enemy team tries to get him out of here, they have to come into this very obnoxious fight where he's got the advantage over them because they're dropping off a ledge and he's just kind of sharky on this high ground. Meanwhile, if they come up through here, up the sponge that's here, and they come up to try and deal with them, then again he's going to have the advantage because he's going to see them coming as they're coming around here, and he's going to be able to position himself nicely, right? So he would get himself into this kind of position and win the game like so, while allowing the rest of his team to push up this way. So he wouldn't be standing up here just looking at the spawn where nobody's coming. He would be sort of up here, throwing bombs, getting an armor ready to go, and maybe if people try to retreat, he'd be able to catch them off, right? This is the sort of thing Shock would do. Now, I'm not saying this to say that Goose is not as good a flanker as Shock, or rather, I'm not saying it to say that Goose is not as good a player as Shock. What I'm saying is that Goose is more suited to playing off his team and sort of ambushing people who are trying to attack. So, if Goose is here and Ray and Owlsy try to go in to start fighting, then Goose kills Owlsy and Ray while they're looking at, say, Sai and Goy, right? Mm-hmm. That's what Goose normally does. That's what his playstyle is. Now, in shifting Shock into a more central role as the player who's quite often riding the tower and having Goose on the flank, Melbourne still has a 3-1, but it's actually more of a shift away from what they're used to than if they just had all 4 players group up and run at Brisbane. So, in other words, it's actually a death ball strat where you have just 4 people group up and push is actually more similar to the 3-1 strat that Melbourne had been running up to this point than the 3-1 strat that Melbourne is running here is similar to the previous 3-1 strat. Just because it's a 3-1 doesn't mean that it's easy. It's the same thing. It's a big shift. If you think about it this way, Shock is changing his playstyle and Goose is changing his playstyle when you shift from a 3-1 with Shock being the one to a 3-1 with Goose being the one. There's 2 fairly fundamental shifts in playstyle here. If you just have everyone group up, the only person who's changing his playstyle is Shock, and the only thing that he's really doing is staying closer to his team. It's not even that big of a change, right? So a death ball strat where Shock goes from being the isolated one to just being part of the group is more similar to what they had been running, even though it's a different strat, right? So making this change here, again, I look at this and I think it seems as though they're sticking with this whole 3-1 idea just because it's a thing that they're doing without actually understanding what, like, the reason why their 3-1 was working in the first place, right? They've got Shock, who understands what needs to be done and sort of understands how the game needs to play out, and he's the one sort of making sure that these guys have an easy time with it. Like, he's going around doing all the odd jobs and making sure that, this part of the map is painted, and so when, normally when you come through here, it's an absolute nightmare because you're fighting uphill, you can't get on top of these guys, but instead, Shock is going to get in here nice and early, take control of this area, then these guys are going to get choked out by having just bombs on one side and specials on the other, and it's going to be impossible for them to push up. To just hold out for very long, rather. And Goose doesn't do this. Instead, he's like on the flank and he's thinking, oh, I want to get these kills, right? So he, instead of going on the flank, he gets ready to go in, but unfortunately, because he's flanking instead of sharking, he's going in without aggro. And not only that, but he's unfortunately mistimed it. It's very hard to see this, but you can tell with the booyah bombs, with the booyahs, that there is a booyah bomb going off on the tower right now. So Goose is going in, but he's sort of mistimed it. Hang on, I just pressed a button here. Thanks to VLC for all these esoteric
wonderful prop options. Yeah.
So like, Goose gets taken out here. Now, the reason we're not sort of talking about this game, aside from the fact that it all takes place below the scoreboard, is because for the most part, this is what the game looks like. Is Melbourne kind of runs at Brisbane, and then Brisbane fends them off, but not enough to actually start a push of their own. And then it's only toward the very end of the game where things finally start to turn around, which is around about here. So in this case, we've got again the same thing. So Goose is going in on the flank, and actually, hang on, let me just. I'm just backing up a little bit to make sure I've got the. Yeah, okay. So again, we've got Goose coming in on the flank. Now this is the point where finally Brisbane's been sort of beaten back. Now Goose is going to come in on the flank, but this time he has an inkjet, which means that instead of having to go all the way up and around and sort of fall victim to Owlsie's sharking, instead he just sort of hops over the ledge here. So this is what, going back to the idea before, where we're not thinking about weapons being good or bad, we're thinking about what they do. T-Tac in this situation has an inkjet. Now, regardless of the state of the meta at any given point in this game's history, Inkjet has always had the property that if you activate it below a ledge, you can go up on top of that ledge, right? It's a way of clearing ledges that are otherwise, that you can't otherwise clear, right? So Inkjet is always this tool that is going to allow you to bypass this very difficult, obnoxious flank and instead just, walk up, activate Inkjet, float up on the ledge, and then start killing people up on the high ground. With, mind you, 0 people otherwise being able to assist with that. Right? You got missiles, I think, going off from Goy, and that's about it. Or they've just gone off because he's got quite a lot of a charge right here. But maybe it was Sai who had the missiles. Either way, so this is what you're looking for, right? Is you need the ability to address this problem that the map is presenting you. And if I think of say a Nautilus on this map, Nautilus also has the inkjet, right? I'm not just saying, like, I'm thinking Nautilus for Melbourne as a really good option because firstly it has the inkjet for this, but also if we think about Brisbane's strategy of this kind of zombie fortress thing where there's a bunch of zombies coming out to fight you, and they've got T-Tacs, and you just shoot the T-Tacs with this weapon that has this insane matchup against T-Tac, is the Nautilus. So it sort of fits these roles, whereas something like the K-Pro, the problem with the K-Pro has always been that, firstly, it can't paint, and secondly, it's, like, too slow. Yes, it gets the 2-shot kill on the T-Tacs and whatever, but it doesn't have enough of an advantage against the T-Tacs to hold out indefinitely, whereas the Nautilus does. So again, like, even if the K-Pro is a better weapon, the Nautilus is more suited to this, to fighting against Brisbane. Anyway, we'll get to that in the next, I think Clamblitz is where he starts using the K-Pro, so we'll worry about that then. But for now, I just want to focus on, like, the difference between what Melbourne was doing before versus what they're doing now, as well as why they made these changes in the first place, or why I believe they made these changes in the first place based on what I'm seeing in these games. versus again Brisbane, who does not make the same mistake. So at this point, this is where things kind of go off the rails for Brisbane. So what we saw, going back just to sort of remind you guys, what we're seeing here is Alzi is trying to watch this flank so that because of course he, like a lot of players, understands that this is the vulnerability point. Like the enemy team has to take control of this in order to push forward, because otherwise the tower is just going to sort of reach here and then get stopped. So he sits here ready for this flank. The problem is that Goose moves up and sits here, which means he's still outside of Alzi's range, and then activates the inkjet, at which point Alzi goes in an attempt, like he sees Goose, so he gets ready to move in, but then the inkjet goes off, and now Alzi's trapped on the low ground because he's now committed off this ledge, as you know, we've talked about ledges and commitment points before, and now Goose is shooting him with an inkjet. So now Alzi gets taken down, and
quite a risky inkjet though, isn't where he? Oh no, where he lands is back there. That's okay.
He's all the way back. Yeah, he's all the way back. Yep. He's fine. He would have been less fine if Alzi had recognized it had been like still up on the high ground, but and therefore not committed to the to dropping down and would have been able to camp the inkjet landing, but still. So like what the point that I'm making here is like this happened because Goose inkjetted up here, and it's the reason why this worked, despite the fact that we've just discussed how Goose's playstyle is not as suited to this role, is because basically he circumvented that whole problem by activating an inkjet. So, and now you know Goose is sort of free in the base. This is like what we were talking about before. This is what I think Shock would have done in that initial situation. Now Goose is sort of doing the same thing. Meanwhile, the tower has now crested the ledge, so now Shock is able to come up and assist. Murray takes a dip. I think he might have been punted off the... I don't know how he actually ended up falling there. It seemed a bit weird. Like there's missiles, but yeah, he just jumps. Okay. Meanwhile, like you can kind of see Sire's like back here and is not really able to come up and help. Has to actually walk up. Like you see, Goy and Sire have both ended up walking along here. Now imagine how much different this would be if Alzi had actually got the kill on Goose and been able to fight these guys back, right? Like it's super easy for if you don't catch the bus up the ledge on the tower, then you got to walk it, and it's very easy to get caught out by doing that. Yeah, at this point the game's basically over. So, like, the point I'm getting at here is Melbourne winning was sort of in spite of the strategy changes that they had. And so if I'm looking at this, like if I'm part of this game and I'm looking at what's going on here, I'm thinking Melbourne won this for two reasons. One, because they had sort of that it's not really a fluke. It's not a fluke, it's not luck, it's not chance. It's they have the tools and they activate them at the right time, but I don't think that they recognize that this was how things had to go. I think they just happened. They sort of stumbled into the right play. Whereas Brisbane, correct me if I'm wrong. I keep forgetting Brisbane. When you win the turf war, you pick the map and the mode, right?
You pick the mode. It actually works out. The other team gets to pick the map.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense then. Okay, Skipper is a really good map against Brisbane. I was concerned that Brisbane had picked it for themselves. We're gonna talk about that now. So we've been talking mostly about Melbourne because obviously Melbourne's lost, and I wanted to get straight to the point of like this is what the problem was. Now, in terms of Brisbane, there's a couple of things happening on this map. So the first one is we've already discussed in previous weeks that Brisbane on tower control, it's not that they're bad at tower control. It's obviously one of their better modes, but it's a little bit difficult for them because generally speaking, what you want is something sort of like what we see on our screen here, where the tower is all the way back and you got three people in front of the tower, right? You got Goose, you got Sai, and you got Goy. Now, obviously, earlier on in this situation, we had Shock on the tower up here, where Sai was back here and Goy was over here, and then Goose was up here. But for the most part, what you want is this kind of setup, where the tower is at the far back, and then everyone else is advanced in front of the tower. Now, this is difficult for Brisbane because they have 2 weapons that like to hang back, and they have 2 weapons that go forwards, which means that in like, if you were to flip this, and you have, you have, say, Mario Neru riding the tower this whole time, one of Mario Neru has to be in front of the tower in order to really make the tower safe. But then getting there with the sort of long-range, slow weapons is quite difficult. Like, imagine trying to have, like, you could imagine a remix going up here, but having a dynamo go up here is like, that's very awkward. And then on top of that, you've also got to take into account the fact that the T-Tex, on top of their job in this particular map of doing what we've just discussed with Goose, of going up into this slick and then taking control of this area so the tower can move into it. The tower, they also have, as we discussed last week, the job of providing a buffer between the enemy team and Mario Neru so that this sort of fortress doesn't crumble. Right, so they keep going out, they keep fighting, so that Mario Neru can trade off them and keep the enemy team away, and then once they finally get a breakthrough, Mario Neru can advance. Right? If they have to do that on top of also taking control of this part of the map, it's very difficult. There's only 2 of them, and they need to somehow break into this against, like, effectively, if they don't get it right the first time on the push, they have to do this against 4 players, which, if there are only 2 of them and they don't have that many specials available to them, I mean, look at the specials that they have here. They have an armor and a booyah bomb that's supposed to be assisting from the low ground. It's not the greatest look here. So walking into 4 people with just 2 T-Techs is not really great, especially when you have to do so when you actually have to walk. You're not swimming up this slick here. So it's very difficult for Brisbane to get anything happening on this map. Even if they had touched the tower, I really doubt they would have got to 9 unless Melbourne had started screwing things up, which then I would doubt, because they've got 2 indirect fire weapons with missiles who are just going to basically sit back, throw bombs, be obnoxious as possible, and let the T-Tex come to them. So this map was a really good choice against Brisbane. And we can even go a little bit further, and there's one thing I want to talk about on this map before we move on, which is we've discussed like the idea that the part of the map that you control, like, actively is just sort of the part, like, let me get a better... so if we go back to, say, here, right? So the part of the map that you're actively controlling is the part that's, like, directly adjacent to you, right? Like, the part that you're able to directly shoot at. What we haven't really discussed is what about this part? What about this part that's behind you? And we sort of touched on that the other week with the Perth game where Riv did that huge backstab on Reef, and sort of ended up
the counter push. Yeah, the reverse push.
Yeah, the reverse retake. Yeah. So there's 2 sort of types of control, right? There's the active or the explicit control where you are actually able to shoot people who come too close, and there's the implicit or passive control where the reason you are in control of this part of the map is because the enemy team can't access it, not because they can't use it, right? Where, like, the reason this is under your control is because they would have to go through you to get to it, and they haven't gone through you, so you still control all of this. Now, there's one very glaring issue with what I just said, which is that you actually can get around these guys by going this way, right? Now, the objective might not necessarily allow you to do this, but when you have someone infiltrate the part of the map that you implicitly control like this, what it means is that suddenly the jig's up. None of this part of the map is safe anymore, because they could be they couldn't be anywhere. Luckily, the game does tell you exactly where they could be, which is in these little green splodges of turf. But imagine, and this is sort of, again, something that Shock does, when Shock gets behind in this situation, he would, like, go up to, maybe he wouldn't go all the way up here, but he would, like, go to here. Like, he would not go past this line. He would paint this entire area nice and green, or if he were on Brisbane's side, but he's obviously not. He would paint this entire area, and then he would just kind of sit there. Because now, if you come back on the retreat to try and clear him out, it's effectively, like, you don't control this area anymore. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is crucial to Brisbane's success, is this idea of implicit control. All right. The reason being because when they have their sort of fortress of Murray and Neru, the Norrie fortress set up, what they do is they take explicit control of some part of the map, say here, and then in doing so, they maintain implicit control of everything else. And then when they move up, they have again the sort of fortress going on where they control everything behind it, and they keep going forward, and then they control everything behind. They keep going forward and control everything behind. And this is crucial in the they need this to be possible on the maps as that they play in order for this strategy to work properly. Now on Skipper, it's not actually possible. The reason is, and we can kind of see it here, like this is kind of why Brisbane didn't advance the way that they otherwise would be known for, is because the first kind of stronghold that they work with is like here, right? So they have, we saw Murray here the entire game, like moving onto this little block thing here. Neru was over here as well. They kept launching Murray and Ray, not Murray, Alzi and Ray at the enemy team from this spot, right? But the problem is, where do they actually advance forward at this point? The next sort of stronghold that you could say is actually this right here. But if you think about it, this doesn't give any implicit map control. It's just kind of there. They can be here, and they can be really hard to deal with if they're standing here. And we actually see this. Let me just find the spot. I think it was around about here. No, sorry, it was here. We actually see this here, right? I say see. It's behind the timer. It might be a bit difficult to see, but there are two people up behind the timer right here. Brisbane's trying to take control of this area, but the problem is that in doing so, they cede control of everything else because there is no implicit map control. You are not standing between Melbourne and the rest of the map by standing up here. Yes, you are safe, but you aren't actually accomplishing anything. This is the difference, right? So even if they take control as part of the map, they can't really expect to gain anything because normally when they do this, the enemy team kind of gets stuck and has to sort of break themselves on this fortress in order to advance forward, which they do, and then they fail, and then Alzi and Ray capitalize. But when it looks like this, and Melbourne can just kind of take control of everything else, they have no obligation to fight this, then suddenly Alzi and Ray are kind of lost, and they end up in these fights on random parts of the map where they end up losing because they don't have an advantage. And suddenly, yes, these two players back here are going to be really hard to kill, but eventually Melbourne just takes control of the entire map and just like throws a bunch of bombs or specials or whatever at them, and they're sort of an afterthought, right? So this is why Skipper in particular is really good against Brisbane, because there is no sort of there's no stepping stone from this to like this, right? Where there's no way to get Murray and Neru all the way from here to here, right? There's no, like, they can go here, but it's not great. They can go here, but it's not great, There's all these, they could, but it's not good enough kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's really important because now we move on to pretty much the exact opposite, which is Manta Maria on tower control. So...
They had a choice of banning this, right? And they chose to ban Arowana.
Yeah.
I guess there's similar issues on both maps, right?
Yeah, and I think you can kind of also see with the way this played out, the reason why, because on Arowana you've got the whole high ground thing, where if you can just imagine, that really high like wall just before the goal on tower control, like imagine if Murray and Neru get on top of that. Right? What the hell do you do in that situation? And it's very feasible for them to do that because they're going to be able to just sort of run down the right-hand side of the map and get up onto that little block that gets on top of the high ground, and then you got the sort of here's the high ground I'm talking about. There's that little block that lets you get on top of it, and then like there's this whole alley open ledge that they can just sort of walk down whenever they get control, and they just sort of take control. Murray here, Naru here, and then what do you do? That would be really dangerous. They also might be less confident on it because of their comp, where this map is a lot more feasible. It's not great for shorter range comps like this, but it's still feasible. You can actually play it. Whereas Arowana, you are struggling against double anchor if you don't have an anchor of your own. So
Yep.
it's not great. So I don't blame, like, if you can only ban one map, like, you're gonna have to take a map like this against Brisbane anyway, and then you have to sort of hope that your third map, which in this case was Anchovy, is enough for you to win. Now, in this, like, I was just talking about the whole idea of the strongholds, right? Now, we've discussed this, I'm pretty sure, in a previous week, how in this map, you have, the bunker here where Murray and Neri are going to get set up.
Murray's
and then they
bunker.
just, yeah. And they just walk across here. And then suddenly they've got...
Bunker. Yep.
Yep. And they've just got the entire tower path pretty much under complete control. And then even then, if they really want to get bold, as the tower's crossing through here, Murray can just sort of hop 1, 2, and then go over here and stand up here. Or Neri could do the same thing. Like, the number of times I've seen Kaji, the Kraken Paradise player,
Yep.
who also mains Splatling, and I'm fairly sure is one of Neri's inspirations, she does this all the time. Every time she has an opportunity on this exact map, on tower control, she will go like so, and then up here with a heavy Splatling or a ball point or whatever, and just camp the enemy spawn directly. And what can you possibly do against this?
Mm-hmm.
So this is like we just mentioned, Skipper is the worst map for not the worst map, but a bad map for Brisbane. And this is a really good map for Brisbane, and this is why, like, straight away you can see the immediate difference. So yeah, this one, because it actually takes place in a part of the map that we can visibly, see, it's a lot easier for us to actually break this one down. So we'll start that here. Now, firstly, you guys actually remarked on this in the commentary, and I was really impressed by it as well, is the fact that basically nothing happens for the first, minute. There are no kills. And I say that's a good thing, because yes, as much as we love the fact that everyone likes to kill each other in this game, this is good play right here. Like, again, it speaks to the discipline that both of these teams have to not just want to run at each other, especially Alzi and Ray, who have traditionally been the kind of run at you T-Tex.
Right.
To have everyone...
Yeah.
To have everyone, stack up like this and actually wait for specials, wait for something to happen, is really, really good. And I say it for both teams. Like, the fact that Melbourne is, sitting back, they know, we have to let Alzi and Ray screw up first. We have to get specials. We have to sort of... we can't possibly push into Murray and Neri when they're set up like this. We need to let them screw up while also taking control of our side. And this is what happens, and sure enough, eventually... Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to commend Melbourne. I was yelling about this in the stream, but they knew this was Murray's map, and you can see how many bombs Shock is throwing at Murray this first 30 seconds, and then for the first 3 minutes of this game, his sole purpose is to stop Murray, and he does an amazing job at it, but unfortunately doesn't hold on to his strat for the whole 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's always the hard part, right? Is at the start of the game, everything's under control, everything is progressing very smoothly, everything's progressing according to the flowchart, everything makes complete sense. It's just that after that is where things happen. To me, I actually have the exact opposite problem, where quite often I'll be the one who screws up at the start because I'm too eager to deathmatch people, and then that just sort of opens up my team to a set play like what we see from Melbourne here. But then after that, we eventually stabilize and we sort of come back. This is sort of, this is... Melbourne, on the other hand, you can definitely see Shock's influence because they do the exact opposite, where they have the really good strat early on, and then over time it sort of deteriorates, and eventually Brisbane gets a really solid foothold. So this is where... and when we actually see here, I think this is where Murray is about to get bombed. I think it's this bomb here, if I'm not mistaken. I'm mistaken. Oh wait, no, because we went back. Sorry. Yeah, it's because we went back. So, you can see, there's been no kills. Everyone on the map has got a special, aside from Alzi. Aside from Ray, who was about to get his special. Look at this. 0 and 1 across the board, right? Nobody's actually died yet. And until now. So Murray has gone down to Shock, and apparently Goy, that's interesting. he got an assist from missiles, I guess. And now immediately Melbourne's on the move. So even though like they straight away lose a player, they're on the move because now it's like this is go time. We've killed Murray. Now we can actually make something happen. And credit to Brisbane for basically making this a mutually assured destruction kind of scenario where everyone's just dead, so nothing can really happen.
Yeah, it went from no one killing each other to like
everyone's dead. But yeah, this is sort of, and this is where things get a little bit awkward for Melbourne straight away. Is Brisbane immediately is able to bounce back and reset because what they've done is like they understand. Okay, well, what we're after is like we want this particular game state where we've got Murray and Nero up top, and then we have control of the low ground, and enemy teams kind of hemmed in their respective hidey holes, right? Whereas the flowchart is sort of the flowchart kind of deal is okay. We've got this kind of setup. We kill Murray, and then we want control of this part of the map. Then we want to do this. Then we want to do that's sort of what the flowchart looks like is to move from one game state to the next, as opposed to recovering to a desired game state, which is what a more improvised playstyle is. Now, I'm talking about improvisation versus flowchart because this is again something that I think defines some of the players overall in this game, where I think Shock, for example, is very much a flowchart player, to the point where you can, like, it's kind of this. You might have heard this expressed as like the idea that there's always like a best thing that you can do in a given situation, right? Like there's a perfect play or whatever. Like this, I think this is more of a chess thing, but not that I'm particularly familiar with chess, but it's just the first thing that comes to mind. But like this idea that there is always an optimal play in a given situation. That's sort of what gives rise to a flowchart playstyle where you're thinking, okay, in this scenario, the best thing for me to do is to go down here, take control of this, whatever. Whereas if you're improvising, you don't really necessarily do that, but you do. It's a lot easier to improvise and take into account various things that are happening across the map, things like what people's tendencies are and what kinds of where exactly people are on the map, and how things have changed compared to what you're expecting. And as a result, if you sort of flowchart and you have a really solid understanding of what you need to do and when you need to do it, then you'll have these really decisive plays. And this is kind of why I say Shock is a bit of a flowchart player, is because what he'll do is, like, in every situation, he'll sort of do the right thing, right? And it's very, like, I'm saying this as a compliment, right? Like, this guy's really damn good at understanding exactly what the best thing to do in each situation is. The issue is that when you're coming up against really experienced players like Murray, for example, Murray, Neru, Alzi, like all these players have played their weapons so much and so often that instead of thinking of a flowchart, what they're thinking of is, this is the situation that I'm in and what I want to accomplish, and this is how I'm going to do it. Like it's not something that they've labbed out or decided on in advance. It's more like, this is what I think I need to do in this situation. And as with most things, what you're looking for is sort of a combination of the two. Like, you want to be able to be really decisive and have a really solid flowchart when things are going right, and then when everything hits the fan, you need to be able to improvise on the fly. And this is sort of like going back to what you guys were saying about how Melbourne has this, and you can sort of see them going back into it here. Melbourne has this idea of like, okay, we wait to kill Murray and then we go, right? Whereas the improvising would be something like, okay, well, Murray is in bunker, so what can we do that doesn't require us to go anywhere near him? Like, what can we do to force him out of bunker? Rather than just like, we need to kill Murray and then we go over here to take control of the right side and push up here and then take control of like this area so we can push through the street, whatever. That's sort of your flow chart of like one thing leads to the next. Instead, you could be thinking about, okay, well, Murray's here, which means he has control of like this whole area. But then that sort of leaves us open to taking control of this part of the map directly without having to worry about him. And then if we do so, maybe he feels inclined to follow us out. Like he feels inclined to jump off the bunker. At which point, maybe we have, if he jumps off the bunker, maybe we actually have a play for that as well, right? This is sort of, I think, one of the things that Melbourne definitely had trouble with, especially because and we'll see this later, Melbourne having a and again we see Melbourne sort of backing up into this situation. The thing is, though, that Melbourne has a bit of difficulty in quickly taking control of the map, and by that I mean they don't have a huge amount of turf. Admittedly, Brisbane doesn't either, but Melbourne's turf output in this game is not great. You've got a Slosher and a Blaster, which can't really paint all that well, and you've got an Ends Up and a T-Tech, which is fine. But the thing is that Brisbane, they have 2 T-Techs, obviously, but they've also got 2 weapons, and we mentioned this last week, that are continually painting, right? So a Slosher and a Blaster don't really stand there and paint the map, whereas a Dynamo and a Remix definitely do.
Should Melbourne have played more Lobster? Would be the other thing that pops out to me, and get that turf output that maybe they're missing, and also at the same time potentially fix up their comps to allow those players to play the weapons that they want to or that they're good at.
Yeah, I mean, that's been the question that we've been asking the last couple of weeks, right? Is how, because we had that one week where Melbourne was fighting Brisbane and they didn't have Lobster, and pretty much again Brisbane came out on top, and it was sort of like the question was how much does Lobster actually need to be part of the team in order to glue all this together? And yeah, I mean, on one hand, yes, the junior would make it so that they take control of the map faster when they do eventually take control. But the thing is that what the problem here isn't that they can't take control of the map quickly, because I mean you can take control of the map with 2 shooter weapons, that's fine. The problem is that they're going to get pushed back constantly by the mid-range, long-range turf from these 2 weapons that are constantly painting. And a junior doesn't help you with that, right? Because the junior doesn't have the range to actually combat these 2 weapons when they're constantly painting. Yes, the junior will paint quickly, and you'll get a million armors by just constantly painting over Dynamo turf, like the edges of the Dynamo turf. But overall, the actual control that is exerted by these 2 weapons is greater than what you would gain like in just a standstill versus a junior, right? So like these guys are, and especially since this is what Brisbane's trying to accomplish, they're trying to slow the game down and give Murray and Neru time to just kind of sit in mid and fortify up and make it so that you can't get to them. Like they're going to be painting in this manner the whole time, so having a junior wouldn't even necessarily change anything. Aside from the fact that yes, you pick junior, you can throw bombs at Murray, but even then, like you would need to. That's sort of a bit of a tenuous kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and sorry, that's not to say that wouldn't work. That would definitely be an option. It's just that you would need to that would need to be part of your strategy, and it sort of seems a bit like if you want to do something against a Dynamo, you pick a Charger, right? That's one of the main options. And speaking of which, we'll get to that later with Sydney. Like, it's anyway. So yeah, I mean I'm trying to actually sort of imagine like what would happen if they had a junior. I don't think anything really changes. It would definitely make it so that, you know, in situations where like, so going back to this original situation here where Murray gets taken out, if a junior is present here, then they steamroll across the map a lot faster in terms of turf control, but the thing is that they don't get the kills quite as quickly. So it sort of balances out in the end. Sometimes it's going to be a lot faster, sometimes they're going to have hiccups where maybe Neru gets a triple kill, which I think she actually did. Like, you can imagine if Sai is instead Lobster here, right? Like, if this is a junior, then Neru is just 1v1ing Shock and the junior's out of the picture. And then he tries to come in and fight Neru, and then Neru just walks backwards 2 steps and is able to outrange the junior and fight it safely. So it's very easy to just say we need more turf, therefore pick junior, but the problem is that the kind of turf that you need is more like what an L3 or a an H3 or a mini Splatling or something would provide, or indeed a Dynamo and a Remix, where you're constantly painting and from a long range and safely.
Yep.
So this is, here's what we're up to.
Amazing it took them... This is the first time Brisbane touched the tower in the first 2 games.
Yep. Took them 8 minutes of gameplay. Oh, not quite 8 minutes because they got knocked out, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is... Actually, no, this isn't quite the situation yet. Murray is just about to do Murray things. This is why they pick... Like, this is literally the reason, is Murray just does this. Where he's got a double kill here. And in doing so, he's controlled the entire stretch from where the tower is right now to around about the 30-point mark. And this could have actually gone even worse for Melbourne if not for Owlsy getting caught by Goy's Slosher here and also not being able to catch Shock. Right, like this Inkjet was kind of hovering around here and Shock just barely managed to sort of hide in a corner away from the Inkjet's shots. And if not for that, he wouldn't have been able to come in behind the tower here. Which is really important because, as we've mentioned before, you need to pincer the tower in order to really clear it properly. And even though Goy and Sai can probably clear this tower, Neru's still here nice and safe and will be providing jumps, which Goy and Sai can't really do a whole lot about. But the fact that Shock is here on the flank and is able to threaten that as well as clearing the tower from behind means that Brisbane actually needs to retreat away from this. Now, they wouldn't know to do that because they don't necessarily know Shock is in this position. So that's completely fine. Now, of course, they... Actually, no, they don't yet. Yeah, so Shock's just got in here. Like, this is way too late for Murray to really do anything. So, yeah, Neru's got to get all the way out. Now, this kind of leads to... so, we've mentioned last week that one of the traps that Brisbane has is that if Murray dies first, or if Neru dies first, then they risk giving up more ground than they would otherwise like to. And we actually see exactly that here. Brisbane kind of dies one by one, so Murray goes down, then Owlsy jumps in and goes down a couple of seconds later. Neru stays a little bit too long, and now Melbourne has used the same kind of thing that Brisbane likes to use against them, and they've basically crossed them out really quickly. The tower's moving the whole time, and now Shock is able to deny Murray the ability to defend.
Yes, and yes. Sorry, I'm just excited about it. Keep going. No. I wanted to point out the same bit. Like, even when no longer throwing bombs at him is a possible thing, he's now in Murray's castle saying, no, you're not coming in. And he's not even looking at the tower. He's not looking at any other player. He is simply shutting down Murray from doing what Murray does on Murray Maria.
Yes, and that's going back to the whole flowchart thing, right? Is we need Murray to be dead in order to advance forward. So what does Shock do? He's single-mindedly just shutting Murray down. He goes straight to the bunker. Like, look at this. Look at it. Look at the way he moves in this whole sequence, right? He goes straight up onto the bunker, and he's just, look at this. He's just straight over, right? He's just there straight away. Knows exactly what needs to happen. This is what good flowcharting looks like. Is you know exactly what needs to happen in 5-10 seconds time. So you do it. There's no delay, right? There's no like, oh, what do I do in this situation? There's no like, messing, like trying to sort through all the equations and trying to figure out what the best... No, you know what the best play is. You know what you need to do. You need to take bunker. You need to deny it from Murray. He's dead. His team is not able to secure bunker for him. Like, imagine if Neru, for example, is able to back up and actually secure the bunker. If she was thinking in a more flowcharty kind of way of like, okay, we need the bunker in order to defend this, and they want the bunker and whatever, then she might sort of walk back and sort of hold this so that Shock can't take it. Or at the very least, delay for long enough for the rest of the team to come in and assist. But instead, she's sort of thinking, it's a 4v1, I've got to sort of try and keep myself alive here, so I'm going to try and back up away and jump out. That's the trap, right? Is now she's been caught, and now everyone's kind of streaming out one by one. Now, Ray is luckily the first out because he died before this all started happening. So there is that little buffer for Murray to work with, but the problem is that Ray is down here and Murray is going here, so the buffer doesn't really take effect the way it could. And so Owlsy's here as well, but he's also going on the bottom side, right? So there's sort of a bit of a miscommunication here, or not even a miscommunication, just like a disunity in purpose, I guess, where Murray wants the bunker because it's the bunker and he's Murray, and Owlsy and Ray are more focused on the bottom side because they're T-Tex, and T-Tex are best suited to the bottom side. And so they kind of end up in this. Murray ends up in this stalemate. Like, credit to both Murray and Shockwave. Murray, like, not dying to Shock, Shock not dying to Murray. Even though Murray, like, obviously knows that he has to be present to help with this tower defense, but he's also, like, not all-inning on the bunker. Somehow Alzi gets taken out in the crossfire there. Like, and then as this sort of progresses, like, you can still see Murray and Shock just, they don't care about the tower right now. Murray and Shock are just locked in a duel, and finally Murray realizes, oh, hang on, I better do something about this. And that is the moment where Shock gets on top of him.
Yeah,
like,
that's it. I from the prize. They're both
like,
thinking the next battle ahead.
yeah. This is like what Shock does, is he'll be this single-minded kind of, I'm going to fight you for 10 minutes if I have to, kind of thing. And he will do that, and then you will get distracted because the tower's doing something, and then he will kill you. Right? This is something we've seen from Shock for years. Like, this isn't just a tournament thing. Like, this is something we've seen for years and years. This is how he plays. Right? And you can absolutely use it against him, but it's also, like, in this case, this is exactly what he needed to do. So, like, my point
but
is...
there's a power to having your positioning, or let's say your flowcharting, down to an easy to understand kind of like next thing I'm going to do, so that you don't have to actively think about that in game. And when Shock just thinks about the one-on-one, and he's just thinking about mind games between the one-on-one, he is concentrating on aim, he is concentrating on chip damage, he is concentrating on like the minute things of that duel, which in my opinion that's why he's so successful in the stuff he does, when he's in the right place at that time. Yeah,
and it's sort of like, that's sort of why he is at the top of the MVP standings, and why he... We've said it before, it's so many times before, it's like, that is what makes him so good at this, like, in this format, and as the, like, this is why he is the player who is the one in the 3-1, right? This is what makes you a good individual, like, by individual, or like isolated independent player, is that you do all these things, you understand what needs to happen in order for the objective to push forward without actually being on the objective, right? So, like, the objective, yes, the objective needs to travel along this path, but in order for it to do that, it can't be getting shot from here, you know? It can't be getting shot from here. And Shock is the one taking control of this stuff, whereas the tower is then handled by the rest of the team. And going back to what we were saying before about Goose being the one who ends up on the flanks a lot of the time, Goose, I don't think, is thinking in terms of these things. He's thinking in terms of, like, if Murray's here, Goose is trying to flank Murray. He's not trying to take control of this, he's trying to kill Murray. And there's a very big difference, right? Where, like, an example of that difference would be, if Murray isn't here, like in that situation we had before, Shock would still go here, whereas Goose would potentially think, oh, okay, well, there's nobody here, so I'm going to go this way instead, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yep, I agree.
It's interesting they're
Go ahead.
Really only a minute away from winning the set. I know it's weird to think about it now, but 29 is a solid push.
Yep.
They just needed 1 minute of defense that they couldn't quite manage.
Yeah, and actually that's sort of the difficulty, right? And we'll actually watch this fairly closely, so we can see straight away. I mentioned before that you only really need 2 players to quickly take control of the map. Look at Ray and Alzi right now. Very quickly taking control. Only takes them a couple of seconds. Now, this is the difficult part, right? This is where the turf output is a problem. Notice how Melbourne is stuck, right? They're stuck all the way back. They can't really make any kind of inroads. This is why I say a junior wouldn't help, because a junior, like, what they need right now is to paint this part of the map. A junior can't do that. They need to paint this part of the map, or this part of the map nice and safely. They could maybe do that with a junior here, but the junior would have to actually pop up and, like, stand up here and then get shocked by Alzi, right? They need to paint and actually take control of the open parts of the map, and a junior would do absolutely nothing to help with that, because the junior can only paint out to, like, here safely. Whereas an L3 could actually paint all the way out, right? Or a Mini, or a H3, or even a CDS. CDS isn't great at painting, but, like, it's good enough. It has the range, and it's hell of a lot easier to play than an H3. You know, like an L3 would be able to like stand here and paint this area, right? It's really important to distinguish between just having faster turf output versus having effective turf output given the situation, right? Again, going back to the idea, there's no such thing as a good weapon or a bad weapon. What we're looking at is the weapon's capabilities and how those capabilities reflect how you want to win. In this case, what we need in this situation to deal with this is mid-range turf, because they're trying to stall out so that they can take control and then build specials and then overwhelm, you know, this kind of passive defense, which they've basically already got. So at this point, you've already lost, but whatever. This is just more to do with the fact that they've just finished a push and painted the entire map in response, right? That's why they have so many specials. So what we need against this is mid-range turf, and a junior doesn't have anything to do with that. So Lob, unless Lob is going to start playing, you know, L3, would not have helped with this. So I don't think it's a comp issue, right? Yep. It's easy to look at this and say, well, they don't have any turf output. The reason they don't have any turf output, the reason they don't have any turf control right now, is because they all just died. So Brisbane was had uncontested turf output across the map, which means that the map just turns their color straight away. It doesn't matter what comp you have. If you're all dead and the enemy team is all alive, this is what the map is going to look like no matter what you do. It's just that from this point, like, the tower is still here, right? Melbourne still has time to mount a defense, or at least solidify themselves in the middle of the map. But they can't do it because they don't have the tools to do so. They need like a mid-range painter to do this. Does this mean that you should always have a mid-range painter? No, it just means that in this situation, this is the kind of turf that you need. So throwing a junior into this comp, despite how good junior is as a weapon, isn't going to solve anything, right? Because it's the wrong tool for the job. And I'm trying to hammer that home because I really think people fixate way too much on whether something is good or bad, where it's actually not even a question you should be asking in the first place.
Okay, yeah. Yep.
And now at this point, I mean, like, and this is like, I mentioned the specials before. This is why it's so dangerous to get into this kind of passive positioning. Look at this. Goy and Goose are fairly safe back here, but they don't have a whole lot of room to work with. So when Owlsy confirms that someone's up here, see, he sees Goose throw this bomb, and Owlsy immediately activates Inkjet in response, right? So he knows that Goose is here, and now Goy shows himself, and Owlsy just turns around and shoots him in the face. And now Goose, he has nowhere to go. He's trapped, so he's dead to the Inkjet as well. Takes Owlsy.
His Goose is cooked.
His Goose is cooked, yes. Gosh.
Sorry.
Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the map, Ray's doing the same thing. Jeez. Oh dear. Like, Ray's getting in on the action on the top side. Unfortunately for him, Shock and Psy have already cleared house. But like, Ray's doing the same thing over here. You can imagine if Shock is still over here and gets stuck in like a corner here, it gets even worse for Melbourne. Right? Now this comes about as a result of, like, again, all these things mounting. There's the constant turf output from Brisbane, from the remix and the heavy. It's not that they paint a huge amount, it's just they paint constantly, which means that Melbourne constantly has to paint in response, which means that they show themselves, or they either give up their positions, which means that this happens, or they stay, in which case the paint just kind of creeps up to them and eventually they get their hand forced, which is what happened in this case. And then this happens again. So it's inevitable.
So what Goy was saying before, and we've had another question here from Lavalave, so what should Melbourne do in this situation with this comp? It's not a comp issue, but because they're playing the best weapons that they have kind of without the Norton carbon, but more, they needed to be more aggressive so that this constant paint couldn't be applied and slowly pushing them back the whole time. Is that?
Yeah, that's so. Let's go from like here, right? So firstly, tower's being pushed, and you know that tower's being pushed, right? Murray is not going to be advancing too far forward. So at this point, you've got two players. Imagine if these two players and these two players kind of just walk forward to this point, right? They find AT tech. Like, 2v1. Let's just kill these guys, right? But they're not going to do that because they're playing defensively, because they're thinking, okay, minute and a half to spare. Let's just play defensively.
Let's hold the 29. Okay,
let's just hold out. But that's not the way you play, right? That's not how you think about this, because and sometimes it would be. If Brisbane were in this situation, that would be the play, because they have the mid-range turf advantage that they can just use to keep Melbourne at bay. The problem is Melbourne, without that advantage, have to actually make inroads. And it's not that they have to force plays, because they're still playing for control of these areas. It's just that they can't be hiding in a corner. And this all balances out, because the reason why they can't be hiding in a corner is because Brisbane, or rather, if they're sort of forced in this situation where they have to hide into a corner, it's usually because of like a rushdown comp where there's all these short range weapons that are running at them. And so if you hold back here, these short range weapons are going to walk up and you're just going to shark them and you're going to push in off that. But if you've got a mid range comp that you're fighting against, they're not going to be doing that kind of aggressive play, which means that you can actually take more aggressive positions as a result. It's it all balances out in a way that I always found kind of interesting. Where just because this is only the right play in a situation where the enemy team is going to lose to this. It's a tautology, but that's the way the game is.
Yeah.
There's no you look at this and you say, oh, what's the right thing to do? Well, again, you look at, it's not just this comp, it's this comp you have to take into account. Right? And Melbourne was thinking, let's play defensively because we're in the lead, and that's what you do when you're in the lead, is you don't throw. But by playing defensively, they throw. So it's you have to actually understand how the comps all match up, how everything works. And again, going back to the whole argument of is a weapon good or bad? No, a weapon is a tool that you use. It has properties, and those properties affect how the game plays out, and you need to understand those properties and how they play against each other.
Right. And as soon as Murray gets bunker and that tower starts going on the street, that's game.
It doesn't even stop. Look,
everyone's got their positioning.
It doesn't stop.
It doesn't stop.
It's being contested, but it doesn't stop. It stops there for a brief moment, but it's all over, right?
Yep.
And that's how quickly this swings, right? Is because they've just lost most of their players as the tower's rounding around this corner. But the fact that because Brisbane is able to take control of this area so decisively, there's just so they've got all these specials just lined up, right? I've mentioned before about if you can build specials and then not have to use them to take control of an area, that means that you have them for the next fight, which is exactly what happens here. Nero never needed to use Booyah Bomb. Both the inkjets were used, and I think the armor was used as well. But the Booyah Bomb was available, which meant that the Booyah Bomb could just go straight here, and then tower just moves to free through the streets. So yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I find myself, and I'm sure a lot of players do this, and you've said it as well, that when you're in the lead, the clock's ticking down, the most natural thing for you to say is, let's defend. Let's, bunker in and figure out how to get this next stop, and that's how we'll win this game.
Yep.
What is a more appropriate micro goal to be to think of in that situation? Because it's a very common situation. Is it something more along the lines of, we need to stop this one player, or hey, two of us kill this one guy? What should we be thinking?
Well, it's definitely complicated. The first thing to do, though, is to dispense with the idea that defending when you have the lead is common sense, because common sense is usually not common sense.
Right.
That's
fair enough.
There's a lot of things in this game. Why do people run anchors? Because it's common sense. There's no actual reason behind it. It's just that people think that it's a good idea because it sounds like a good idea. Unfortunately, if you look at it a little bit more closely and understand what an anchor actually achieves in a game, then the reason why you run an anchor is you narrow it down to because the anchor does a thing that we need it to do to win, as opposed to because it just makes sense to have two frontliners, a mid-ranger and a backliner. It just makes sense is the worst argument you can possibly have, because chances are you haven't actually thought about it that much.
Okay.
So again, it's the same I'm sort of talking about it a little bit abstractly because that's the problem, is that you're thinking about it in terms of what makes sense. We've already got the lead, so we should just defend the lead. Well, how do you defend the lead, you know? Like, the number of times I've seen games lost because the team decides we're going to defend the lead and they sort of walk up to here and stop, which gives the enemy team 2/3 of the map for free, which allows them to build all their specials. Spoiler alert, we just watched this. Build all their specials up and then overwhelm these tiny little holdouts with just 4 specials straight to the face. I mean, I've been watching this exact situation happen for like 5 years now. How long since Splatoon 1 came out? 2015,
5 years in total, yeah.
I've been watching it for 5 years. Right? This hasn't changed. People haven't learned. All right? Yeah. Why do I get irate when I talk about this stuff? It's because I've been watching it for 5 years, and I've been saying it for actually more like 4 years, and people aren't learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying so first thing first is that when you have the lead and the clock is ticking down, you do not go into a defensive stance.
You don't give up the map for free, right?
You don't give up the map for free, okay.
It's the same as... Again, it's going to be a tautology, but you do the thing that's going to win you the game. Brisbane can go into a defensive setup, right? They can have Murray stand here, they can have Neru either on the grates or like over here or whatever. They can have just a couple of people sharking around here. They can actually go into this defensive setup because that is the way that their comp is strongest. That is the strongest position that they can be in. This anchorless comp is an aggressive comp. The reason you run anchorless is because you want to have the ability, like you need the most flexibility for having 1 person on the tower and 3 people move up. It gives you robustness. It makes it so that no matter who goes down and no matter who is on the tower, you will always have a strong frontline presence that allows you to push the tower forward in any situation. That is the reason why you go anchorless. Now, in that situation, if you split up and go over just to random parts of the map and hide, that's not really going to work toward the sort of death ball or even the 3-1 that this strategy is trying to accomplish. You're going to a defensive setup without actually understanding what is strong for your team. The correct thing to do is do the thing that is strongest for your team. In this case, you take control. Yeah, you take control of these parts of the map and you push in, right? You take advantage of the fact that they've only got 2 players who can actually fight you close up and expect to win. Obviously, the Dynamo, the Dynamo needs to have the first swing, right? And if they do, they get the kill. If they don't, or if they screw up, then you kill them. And ultimately, it doesn't even matter if these guys stay alive because these guys are the ones pushing, right? The T-Techs are the ones pushing. This is, again, going back to this is what an anchorless setup is. It's a very flexible setup. You have 1 person on the tower and 3 people up here, and any combination of those 1 and 3 should be successful. Whereas in this, if Murray and Neru are the 2 people who are alive, the push can't really continue. In most maps. On this map, yes, you kind of can because Murray can just stand here and control the entire bloody map. But that's like why this map is picked in the first place. But if they lose Alzi and Ray, their ability to push the tower completely vanishes. Whereas if these guys, for example, lose, I don't know, Cyan and Shock, these 2 players can still push just fine. If they lose if they lose Cyan and Goy, these 2 players can still just push fine. Like the whole point is that any combination of 2 players can still push the tower.
Yep. Okay.
And that's why you run this comp. So the strength here is in the fact that any combination of players is going to be effective in any formation, right? So you can just group up and push. You can pick a direction and go. It's easy to execute.
Great. Okay, so the call in this should have been like, okay, guys, we're in the lead, it's counting down. Let's group up and keep pushing.
Yeah, like
let's stick together and keep pushing. Yeah.
In this situation, you got 3 people grouped up here, and what happens is 2 people go one way, 1 person goes the other. Everyone should just go the same direction, right? Give them the bunker. What point is the bunker if the tower's back here and you control this and then get onto their bunker, right? So again, this is sort of the improvisation kind of thing. All right, so if we're in this situation, we push from here, we go down this way. If Murray is trying to get over to our bunker, the only reason our bunker is important is because Murray can get into it. But if Murray is over here defending from his bunker because we pushed this direction, then obviously this bunker is no longer a problem because now Murray isn't using it. So while Murray isn't using it, we don't have to worry about defending it quite so much. The reason why this is possible is because the tower's back here and they have to defend the tower while it returns into mid. In order to do that, that means that Ray and Alzi also have to stay in proximity to the tower, because if they wander off too far, like if Ray in this position is actually very liable to get caught out and die and give Melbourne a chance to defend. The reason why this doesn't happen is because Melbourne has already decided they're going to stay back here and defend, instead of trying to look for opportunities that work toward what their comp is capable of doing. Now, if they were able to move toward this tower here and catch it, while it's still sort of on this side of the map, then this bunker is not a problem. Murray gets locked down to this side of the map, so this bunker is doubly not a problem. And then that means that you also control implicitly, like going back to the whole idea of implicit versus explicit control, if you're controlling along this line, this bunker is under your implicit control, which means Murray can't even get to it anyway. So it's like all these things work together to make it a better idea than just sitting back here and waiting for something to happen.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. That makes sense. And once again, to what Goy said, all great in theory, but to digest this and to enact in the middle of a match, especially a high pressure match such as a semi-final, is a very hard thing to do.
Yes, it is.
Would you suggest to maybe think about this before the game starts? So to have a...
No, this is something you have to actually dedicate a lot of time toward. Like, this is not something you learn overnight. Right. But the reason I'm making such a fuss about it is because, like, you need to, like, I'm saying this because, like, and we can talk about this ending a little bit, but I think we want to move on.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm trying to make this point not because, like, I'm expecting overnight improvement, but because this is the way, you know, people, like, why am I the one on this analyst desk talking about how the games are going? Why can't someone else do this? It's because other people so consistently are thinking in terms of what's good, what's bad, what's, you know, and, like, I don't think that what I'm doing is particularly, you know, special or, you know, profound or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
All it is a shift in perspective. It takes
I think
a while.
you're special, FLC.
Thanks, but
you're ruining the point.
But, like, what I'm doing, it's not that what I'm doing is something that only I can do. It's what anyone can do, but you have to have that kind of you have to be able to shift your perspective away from thinking about all these things that don't really matter and start thinking about the game as it is.
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to the game as it looks through all these lenses of the meta and and common perception and common sense and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, right. And I think another point is people like right and wrong, people like black and white, and people like yes and no.
Yeah, because it's simple. It's easy.
Right. It's simple and it's comforting. It's comforting to know that I can pick another weapon because a weapon is better, therefore I did good. And that, you know what I mean? Yeah. Whereas, like, this freeform jazz idea that you have and the tension that it kind of, that you feel and how nothing's certain, nothing is 100% and everything is conditional is a craft, is a muscle that you have to flex over and over and over again and build that, which is, it's not something that everyone kind of has in their mindset or in their repertoire.
Yeah, it's something you have to develop, and it's why I'm saying, yes, it's difficult, and I'm saying this partly as well because this is the last show, and it's like I'm trying to sort of leave everyone with something to mull over, yeah. But what I'm getting at here is that it's about the shift in perspective from what, like, arbitrary things, like what is just good, what people have decided is good for a map or a mode or whatever, or when, you know, like, just as another example, like, I've heard people say, like, you can't push the tower until 2 people on the enemy team are down, and it's like, okay, yeah, it kind of helps.
But there shouldn't be a black and white blanket rule.
Right? Like, it's why is that the case? Thinking about why something is the case is like, you know, what is actually happening? Why does the NZAP, like, why do people use the NZAP over the Junior? If people are armor botting, why are people not using the Junior? Right? The Junior gets more armors than the NZAP. But why have we got an NZAP instead of a Junior? Well, it's because the NZAP does other things instead of just what the Junior does, whereas the Junior is just sort of dedicated to armors, whereas NZAP can actually fight people. Wow. Like, it's just an extension of that. That's all I'm doing. That's all I'm saying. is the more assumptions and the more arbitrary ideas that you can dispose of as you learn the game, right? These ideas are good for helping you to like get to a decent level in the first place, right? They sort of help you to construct ideas about the game and start to reason about the game, even if only on a very basic level. But then as you get better, you need to start thinking in terms of, you know, it's like how people say you need to learn the rules before you can break them, right? It's the same. That's it, right? You know, yes, when you're first starting out in the game, you probably don't want to be picking a comp that doesn't have a whole lot of turf control the way like Melbourne has here, right? But if you understand what that turf control is, like what it's trying to accomplish, what you're trying to do with it, then, hey, maybe you actually have an idea of how you can sidestep the problems that come with low turf control and turn that into a successful game. And again, like that comes down to understanding, like, to always being able to question, or not even question, just like to understand why something is important down to a fundamental level, right? And this is the case for Splatoon. It's the case for, you know, your academic studies, whatever. It's not something that you can just do just because I've said that you can do it, because it's something that definitely gets a lot easier as you get older and your prefrontal cortex develops. That's just a, you know, but like if you can start doing it now, then in a couple of years or even a couple of months, maybe you've already got all the pieces there and you just need to connect them all together. Maybe in a couple of months' time, then
look, and it's not just Splatoon; it's every game, right? Any game that you,
anything,
anything.
Right?
Yep. It's a mindset shift. Yep.
So that's what I'm sort of getting at here. It's all like I'm saying things like, you know, there's no such thing as a good or a bad weapon, and you need to have conviction and you need to be decisive and all that sort of stuff. But it's all the same principle. At the end of the day, so we're getting very philosophical. But this game,
life is just a bunch of squids and ink.
It really is. But yeah, so with this game, I'm just kind of letting it play out because I do want to get onto Clan Blitz and we've got half an hour left. But what we're seeing in this game is a little bit of everything that we've already discussed. So, for example, Brisbane, it's difficult for Brisbane to get a push going because they only really have 2 players to actually advance forward through the map. Meanwhile, Melbourne is getting rebuffed at every turn because every time they try to make anything happen, they're always losing players to Mario Neru on the way in, which means they run out of manpower by the time they get to the second checkpoint. And so we sort of start to see a little bit here of like how Brisbane has to have Murray go up and advance up to actually be part of this sort of front 3, and it's not really a natural thing to do. And like you can see here, Murray and Nero are both back here, but then Ray is like fighting effectively 1v3, and so even though he actually succeeds quite nicely, the Brisbane is still all the way back, right? And now Sai, I think at this point, you could argue that Sai should have been up trying to defend the tower, but at the same time, if she wasn't, then Alzi would have come in and probably killed Goy, and there's no guarantee that Sai would have been able to stop the tower in time anyway, especially with Murray there. So even though this is actually sort of the moment where Brisbane takes the decisive lead and therefore the set win, you can see it's only a couple of points. I would also argue that the position that Melbourne is in here comes about partly because Brisbane has already sort of like... I'm actually concerned as to why Melbourne sort of all stacked up as 3 there, but like you can sort of see how a lot of things have to go Brisbane's way in a very specific way. Like Murray needs to be up and actually getting kills, and then when he retreats, then they lose all their momentum, right? And Nero is meanwhile in the tower, so it's like they've got 2 people back, 3 people forwards. Sorry, 2 people forwards, which means Melbourne can very easily overwhelm the 2 people pushing. So this game, and in general, this is the way Brisbane is going to look on tower control, except for on maps like Manta Maria, where you can make do with fewer players, either because the map is really narrow, or because one of those players, like Murray, for example, is going to get up on top of bunker and just control like a huge part of the map from a very safe position, right?
Right.
And another thing, so I forgot to mention this, but I've mentioned just before we move on to clams, the buffer. Like I mentioned, that there needs to be a buffer between the enemy team and Murray and Neru, and that buffer is usually provided by just the bodies of the T-Tex, right? But in Manta, and to a degree on this map, when you see Murray, where was he on the fan? He was on the fan around about here. There's sort of a buffer here, right? That's just provided by the map itself, where the enemy team like has to go through something to reach Murray, and whether that's a teammate or just a part of the map that's really obnoxious, like for example the street on Manta Maria, the buffer is still provided. So that's another reason why Manta Maria is so good for Dynamo, is because the Dynamo always wants that buffer, and the map actually provides a buffer, a very big buffer at that, in the form of that whole street section with the wall you have to climb, and then it's just a nightmare, right? So, all right. Anyway, Clam Blitz. So, again, going back to the idea of like decisiveness and understanding what needs to happen, Melbourne should have been more willing to pick Rainmaker. It's easy to say that given hindsight, but even then,
I mean, I said it at the time, so
yeah,
let's give him a point there.
There you go. Like, think about let's just go through how Brisbane operates. They've got two very defensive players who like to sort of hop from stronghold to stronghold. They've got two aggressive players. In Rainmaker, that doesn't make any sense, that strategy, right? Because you have to move a lot quicker than this kind of hopping from checkpoint to checkpoint. You could maybe argue, again, on Rainmaker, that maps like Manta, maps like Camp Triggerfish, the sort of longer maps where you can't push from one side of the map to the other in one go, like I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the sort of idea of the middle third. If you can traverse the middle third quickly, then you want a short-range aggressive comp. If you can't, then maybe this defensive comp works a lot better. But on Clan Blitz, the whole, like, it's basically splat zones. Like, the first part of the game is basically splat zones, where you're controlling sort of the middle part of the map and then a little bit more, so that you get a bunch of clams. And then you, at some point, need to walk in and score, right? That's how Clan Blitz sort of works, as a very general idea, which means that this defensive comp is perfect for clams, right? Because if they get set up here, they're going to get a million clams. They're going to be able to just chill and then wait for Alzi and Ray to eventually make inroads. And in this case, they've got Ray on the L3, which I'm not a huge fan of. I definitely think that if one of these two... I mean, Alzi plays L3, doesn't he? I mean, he plays H3.
H3, yeah. Yeah. Quite well in his defense.
I would have thought that... Like, in practice, I think Ray on the sort of turf-focused weapon makes sense, but at the same time, I think Alzi probably can play L3 quite well, so I'm not really sure. And again, so as I said at the start of this broadcast, Shock on the K-Pro instead of the Nautilus is something I'm really concerned about. Another thing is Slosher Deco sucks. Don't use it. Either use the vanilla or the soda. I know we just said that there's no bad weapons, whatever. But soda Slosher, like when I say a weapon is bad, it's because the tools that it has are very weak, right? Things like so point sensors, right? Point sensors are actually busted as hell. It's just that they don't provide what you need to win a game, right? Splashdown is really good at countering like every other special in the game, along with like Brellas and all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't provide something that you need to win the game. It's just a defensive tool. Toxic Mist is very obnoxious to deal with on Rainmaker, but ultimately it doesn't actually do something that you need to win the game. Slosher Deco is kind of in that category for me, where yes, it has a baller and that's very nice on Clan Blitz or whatever, but the sprinkler just ruins everything that it's doing, because your baller is going to be sort of it's going to be like it's sort of just one thing that it does, whereas like what happens when you're trying to sort of get a baller push going, and we'll probably see that. I haven't actually looked for this in this video, but we'll probably see that with like Murray and Brisbane, is you get these baller pushes off when you've already peppered the enemy team with bombs and indirect damage and whatever. And so having a sprinkler that doesn't really play a part in that is an issue, right? Because you can't actually contribute to the thing that you're trying to make happen. You can't contribute to the baller push. You can't contribute to to advancing in on the enemy team sufficiently so that the baller push actually does what you want it to do without just throwing the game by making everyone die. Everyone on your team die, that is. So again, what we're looking for here is, so once again we have Shock back on sort of more of the 1 instead of the 3. So like you can see straight away he's sort of getting in position to go on this flank. There's 3 people running after him, and what does he do? He goes up and somehow doesn't die to Murray. I think Murray's got a bit unlucky there, and gets up into here. So we've seen Shock do this, and he does it with an NZAP most of the time, and when he does, this entire area gets painted in about 2 seconds flat, and he uses an armor, and then the rest of his team pushes in this direction while the armor's going off, and now these guys who have all been chasing Shock up this direction get caught, gives Melbourne mid control, and allows them direct access to here while isolating the players who are over here. And in doing so, like you can kind of see how when Shock is doing something, this is like why Shock is good as the 1 in the 3-1, is because he can do this and then provide a means for the 3 to take control of the map in a sense where in a scenario where he's effectively kind of written himself out of that exchange. Now, unfortunately, he has a K-Pro, which means that he can't really paint anything and is sort of stuck on this side, while meanwhile, as we've said before, the sort of weakness of this 3-1 idea is that if one team just recognizes that the 3-1 split has occurred and they lean into one side of that split, as Brisbane is doing right here, where they're throwing a booyah bomb and sort of getting ready to push in, then this team can very easily overwhelm this team because these guys are, well, Murray is all the way back here trying to deal with Shock, but these guys are pushing in and are able to take advantage of the fact that Shock, who is the main firepower on this team, given that you've got a Brella and you've got a Ballpoint, which are fairly low killing weapons, and obviously no bombs on the Soda Slosher, on Slosher Deco, means that Brisbane is more equipped to immediately push in as a result of Shock going on an adventure. Now, this is a sort of flashback to the Manta Maria, that one fight in Manta Maria that lasted like a minute and a half.
Yeah.
So this time, Murray is the one who's keeping Shock at bay. Unfortunately, does end up dying to a bomb, but like you can sort of see how. I'm not necessarily saying a Nautilus would have anything to do with this. This is more like I've said before, the NZAP and the Nautilus both are kind of weapons that you can sort of do this solo plays on, because the NZAP is kind of a strategic thing, right? Where you do your own thing, but then you, by taking control of this part of the map, can then armor and affect what's going on over here. And the Nautilus, meanwhile, just has significantly better matchups against all these kinds of short-range kind of weapons, right? The K-Pro, for example, does not have a particularly good matchup against the L3. Like, it's not a straight-up win. Whereas the Nautilus, I would say, definitely does, because of how much range it has over the L3, even though the L3 can use certain tools against the Nautilus, which we won't go into. And for example, like we can look at what Shock's doing right here. This is the classic Shock move of getting into a part of the map the enemy team isn't, and then just stand there and paint. And look how little he's accomplished with that, because he's got a K-Pro instead of an NZAP, right? So he's sort of doing a cross between what he would normally do on the NZAP and the Nautilus, and in doing so, he's accomplishing very little. So, like, instead of getting massive amounts of turf control here with an NZAP, or being able to sort of at any point hop across here and just kill someone who's up here with the Nautilus, or someone who's up here with the Nautilus, then he's sort of stuck in between, where because he's doing his painting thing, then he's taking forever because the K-Pro takes forever to paint, and then he's also not in position to like hop across here and then maybe kill Owlsy or Ray on the respawn. So it's sort of, he's in between the two playstyles of Nautilus and NZAP, and as a result is not able to play one. Like, it's sort of the jack of all trades, master of none kind of deal, right? Meanwhile, the rest of the team, without having that kind of usual decisive play that Shock normally brings, is kind of, they're in good positions in mid, but how are they going to break through, right? There is nothing that's really stopping. Like, see how there's no bombs. There's an auto bomb. You can actually see the auto bomb. It's up next to Owlsy right now, about to go off. There you go. That's the only bomb that is present in this group of 3. Whereas in the previous games, we had Goy on the Vanilla Slosher, which has a suction bomb, Psy on the Grim Range Blaster and the Vanilla Range Blaster, both of which have bombs. Like, the Grim has a burst bomb, which doesn't really count, but... and then Goose on the T-Tech, right? And Shock was on the ends up and quite often being along with them as well. So they had 4 bombs, or 3 bombs and a burst bomb. So they were able to actually, like, you can imagine, if they have, like, a whole bunch of bombs going off here, then Murray is not able to, like, it's a lot harder for Owsy to be here. Murray is not, he's not here, but he would not be able to be here. So, and this is sort of why, when I look at a Slosher Deco, what I see is, it's not that Slosher Deco can't be, like, it's not that Slosher Deco doesn't have useful tools to it. It's just that what I see when I see someone pick Slosher Deco is I see someone who's picking Slosher Deco for the baller. And what I imagine is, okay, if you want the baller, you pick something other than a Slosher Deco. And if you want the Slosher, and you also want a baller, then you're probably thinking about, like, you want the Slosher for one reason, and you want the baller for another reason, but you're not actually thinking about how the Slosher Deco itself fits into the greater picture. It's like... and I'm not saying this is necessarily what Goy is thinking. I suspect it's basically just like... I suspect it's basically just like, I'm a Slosher player and I want a baller. Like, it's... but a lot of players who sort of flex onto Slosher and pick Slosher Deco just kind of randomly have this issue. And I see it, like, again, it's something I've seen for years. Where people are sort of not really considering how the weapon actually functions as part of the entire team. Like, this is why people don't use Vanilla Slosher, even though Vanilla Slosher, if you think about Vanilla Slosher in terms of what it provides for the team, you've got a very cohesive kit of, like, suction bomb and missiles, where you're constantly able to, you know, just pepper this entire area and get ready for a push with AoE damage. The Vanilla Slosher has a very distinct identity that you can fit into a comp very easily. And this is what Melbourne actually had in previous games, where they had Psy and Goy both using, you know, Range Blaster and Vanilla Slosher, Grim Range Blaster and Vanilla Slosher, both of which have a lot of sort of indirect damage, the Range Blaster being a bit more explicit with that indirect damage. And they also both have missiles, right? And the missiles self-synergize, because when you have more missiles, you have more paint from the missiles, you more AoE damage, it's all good. So having the Vanilla Slosher and the Grim was really good, because even though they're not necessarily the weapons you would immediately think of when you think of good weapons, they work really, really well together. But now they've exchanged this for a Cerellabrella and a Soda Slosher. Neither, like, this one has an auto bomb, which we've already discussed. You want other bombs to go with that auto bomb, so the auto bomb is stronger. But instead, you've got a Sprinkler, which is not a bomb. So, and then Shock could fix that by working with the team, but he's not playing like that. And for him to play like that, he would need to actually group, and he's sort of not doing that because he's thinking he's going to go off and do his own thing and sort of win the game that way. So it's like, what I'm seeing here, like the big picture of what I'm seeing here is, yes, we can talk about how each of these individual plays lead up to whatever, but what I'm seeing here is things like this, where the purpose of each part of this team is not clear, is not defined, and the team suffers for it. Whereas in Brisbane's team, yes, they use the same thing every game, and sometimes it's bad because the map doesn't suit it, like on Skipper Pavilion, and sometimes they have Ray picking L3 for some reason. But the overall identity of the team, what they're trying to accomplish, is a sound idea. So even though, and we spoke last week, to just sort of segue into talking about this weekend's game, what we was talking about last week was the idea that Sydney sometimes looks a bit shaky, but what they are doing is effectively they're winning like 60-40, right? They're using their individual skill to win most of their fights, and as a result, they win a greater percentage of their games, which is usually enough for them to win a set. Brisbane has a similar kind of idea where instead of individual skill, which they definitely do have, mind you, their strategy is good enough, and their team identity is good enough, such that when they have bad games, it's always in the minority, right? They've got 60-40 in terms of strategic, like good strategy, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, and that's going to be really interesting because we're going to basically sort of see what happens when you have this sort of 60-40 in terms of strategy versus the 60-40 in terms of individual skill. Where Sydney, because they aren't thinking too much about what they're trying to accomplish in terms of strategy, actually has almost an advantage over some of these sort of half-baked teams, where teams like Melbourne, who are a little bit indecisive with their strategy, lack a little bit of conviction, are going to fall short against Sydney because Sydney isn't falling into that sort of halfway point. They're not going halfway and they're not quite following through. They're instead just not bothering at all, and instead they're getting a lot out of just being, individually strong. Whereas Brisbane has actually gone all the way. Brisbane has actually made a cohesive strategy, and they're confident in it, and
and they run it for better or worse.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter the map. They try and pick the map the best they can, but Brisbane is a collective set play, right?
Yeah, so, and this is sort of one of the things that's happened a lot in Splatoon, is you always get these teams that are just like a bunch of T-Tacs who run at you. As we mentioned the other week in the caveman strat, right?
Caveman strats.
And why do these teams keep winning? It's because it's actually because they're not trying to be tactical and trying to like overthink things. Like, this is what it means to like not overthink things. Is Sydney doesn't overthink things. Like, yeah, they could probably stand to learn a little bit of strategy to maybe make better out of some of the maps like Skipper Pavilion, where you have to actually have good rotations and that sort of thing. But at the same time, what they do allows them to play they play decisively because they are just playing in the moment, right? They're not trying to think of like, oh, do I have to do this with respect to my team or whatever? No, they're just thinking, okay, if I shoot this guy, he dies, and that's good, right? It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and it actually works really well, especially against half-baked strategies where you don't quite understand what's going on. And you aren't quite able to adapt to what needs to happen. You don't know the adaptations that need to be made. And actually, like, and speaking of which, like, this is actually an interesting little idea, right? This is a little interesting little gimmick, where the first 30 seconds of this game, there's 2 torpedoes just going off over and over again at this part of the map, and just constantly flying at Murray, like, this idea of running double torpedo to screw with the dynamo is fine. Like, I'm on board with that. What I'm less on board with is the idea that you've just kind of grabbed this one thing that you can do to piss off the dynamo and just slotted it into your team comp without really thinking too much about like how that's going to affect the big picture. So yes, you've got Lob with the bubbles, who can put the bubbles here, and then you can swim up under the bubbles and like, we all know what bubbles do on this map. You've got Psy on the K-Rapid, who has a baller who you can jump to if you... We all know the obvious stuff on Clan Blitz. But when we're competing, like, you notice these guys don't have a baller. These guys don't have a bubbles. They don't have. They're running the exact same thing they've been running the whole time, and they go 3-0 in Clan Blitz, right? This game was both of these games are relatively close, but the reason this is working is not because it's because they have a sound, cohesive strategy, and it's not because like they don't need a bunch of like ballers and bubbles and torpedoes and whatnot to make the strategy work. They're not trying to beat the mode. Like, they're not trying to cheap out on the mode. They're playing the game. And instead of like when you pick things like K Junior, right? This is quite often the situation you end up in. What we see right here, where you got your bubbles and you kind of use them, and you're like, hang on, now what do I do? Right? Because your entire weapon is defined, like you picked this weapon because you want the bubbles for Clan Blitz or whatever. But then like you use the bubbles, and then like what are you doing aside from using the bubbles? There's no cohesiveness. There's no big picture there. Your weapon is a bubble bot, right? Your weapon, or if you pick Junior and like you just do it for the turf and the armor, right? People constantly complaining about, oh well, Junior is just an armor and turf bot. It's so boring. But then you watch someone like Gray from Alliance Rainbow play Junior, and he's completely on another level with it. Why? Because he's playing the weapon as opposed to just being a turf and armor bot, right? Where you put a weapon like a K Junior in your comp just because it's got bubbles or just because the K Rapid has baller or whatever, and you're going to end up in situations like this where you use your special, the one thing that you picked your weapon for, it doesn't work, and now you have no idea what to do, so you end up back on top of your teammates. Meanwhile, the rest of your team, rest of the enemy team, is just playing the way they always have, understanding exactly how everything fits together, and pushing you into a corner, right? So, and like, yeah, through this game, you will see that eventually, like, yeah, some of these gimmicks actually work, right? The torpedoes do eventually, Alzi does get caught by this K-Rapid. The torpedo's got a kill on, I think, Rave just before. It's difficult for, I think Neru actually misclicked on this jump. I don't imagine why she would jump to Ray in this situation. I think she was trying to jump to Murray. But nonetheless, it does work out in their favor. And that gives Melbourne a way in. So, and now, obviously, yes, you have the bubbles that you picked your weapon for in the position that you ideally wanted them, and Sai's going ham with the baller at the same time, right? This is what you picked your weapons for, so it works. Right? This is what you had in your mind when you picked these weapons, so it's going to work out. The difficulty is, okay, you've done that, now you have to defend. Okay, now where's the K Junior going to go, right? Like, do you know where the K Junior goes when you're defending in this situation? Do you, like, I'm assuming Sai knows how to play K Rapid in the situation. Right? Like, how does, you pick a Slosher Deco for the baller. What does the Slosher Deco do without bombs in a situation like this where you have to defend, right? How are you going to stitch all those, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we had bubbles for the clam push? How are you going to stitch that to what we do when when the enemy team's pushing in and we've got to defend somehow? So, like, again, going back to what Goy was asking about, like, how do you actually, it's all well and good to say this, but how do you do it in the middle of a game? Yes, you need a perspective shift. It's not something you can just do overnight. But at the same time, I think it's relatively reasonable to be able to say, like, because you start to see the patterns in these underlying assumptions that you make, right? Like, we're looking at, like, why is the Soda Slosher, like, why do I not like Slosher Deco? Why do I think that K Junior is potentially not the pick here? It's because you've got this one thing that you're trying to accomplish with it, but that one thing does not encompass the entire game, right? So you look for patterns like that, right? It's easy to... The question, you get into the habit of asking the right questions. The right question in this case being, okay, we've got the Soda Slosher. I keep saying Soda Slosher. The Slosher Deco has its baller. What does the Slosher Deco do when it doesn't have baller? Right? It's very easy to just say, okay, we've picked it for this. What happens when not this? Right? Like in Murray's case, what does the Dynamo do? Like, you'll quite often see, like, we had a weeks there where people were picking Piranha Pit and then putting a Kenza Dynamo on one of the ramps, right? What does the Dynamo do when they are not able to get to one of the ramps? Murray can answer that question. A lot of these other Dynamo pickers that we've seen can't. All right? That's the difference.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, like, this was... I am amazed that... I mean, I was about to say that I was amazed, but then I took another look at what weapons are actually shooting Nero at this point. It makes a whole lot more sense. Again, going back to what I was just saying, like, this is one of those situations. Like, you've got someone trying to backdoor, and you've got a K Rapid and a K Junior trying to defend. How do you kill them?
Yeah, you've got torpedoes that take a while before they actually explode. You've got two weapons without specials that can't kill instantly. Yeah, it's a good point.
And then Neru just walks away. Like, and imagine Brisbane's in that same situation. How do they kill someone who's doing that? Well, they just shoot them. You know?
Yeah.
Lob
with everything. Yeah.
Everything can handle that, and all the players know how to handle that situation. Right. So, and I must admit, like, I would almost want to start talking about this game in a bit more directly and actually say what's going on and all that sort of stuff. But I really want people to understand this sort of more conceptual stuff, because this is what sort of differentiates a lot of these sort of top players, right? When someone is, and by the way, like this push is really well done by Ray. Like, what differentiates like someone who is like really good at the game is usually the fact that they are able to think in these terms, right? Rather than just thinking about this one gimmick that they want to run. That might be a starting point, right? You might see someone pick like a Dynamo on Pit or something, just because they think, oh yeah, Dynamo on Pit's is a really cool thing. I want to mess around with this. But the key thing is, and you'll see like people like Kyo do this, where they'll pick up a weapon and they'll understand what they need to do with it, but then they'll also be able to understand what needs to happen in between those moments, right? This is why people like Kyo, and I would say people like Nex as well, can quite often pick up weapons and then just be really, really good with them. And I can say from experience, like sometimes I'll pick up a weapon and I'll think, oh, this needs to do this, but then I also want to like also know what else needs to happen alongside it. It's like that distinction is really important. Like when I can tell that I've done that is when it works really well, and when I can't do that, like I've picked Dynamo before and like had no idea what I'm doing aside from the one point where I know the Dynamo is strong, right? Like, I've picked Dynamo on Manta Maria, and I've played the sort of bunker area, but then at some point I'm forced out of the bunker. What do? I have no idea. And so that's where everything falls apart, right? Whereas... Yeah. So...
Yeah, look, and it's a good sentiment to finish up on, because it kind of leaves that question in everyone's mind that don't pick you can one trick a weapon, but then don't one trick that weapon inside the game. Like, you're not there to do the one thing that weapon can do.
Yes.
You need to think about how that weapon is going to work for the 5 minutes of that game.
Like what defines Mari as a good Dynamo one trick isn't the fact that he knows how to play the bunker on Manta. It's that he knows how to play everything else as well on Manta. He knows how to play outside the bunker on Manta. We said it on Port Mackerel. It's a bad map for Dynamo, but Murray still knows how to play it because he knows how to play Dynamo. When you're one-tricking something, this is what it means to be good at one-tricking, is that you understand how to play the weapon better in situations, like in a situation where the weapon isn't ideal, you still know how to play it better than you would know how to play other weapons, right? It's the reason, like the reason you don't just switch over to T-Tac or whatever is because, yes, you could pick T-Tac and just be fine everywhere, but you actually understand how to make the best out of every situation with your one-trick weapon. And one-tricking isn't just down to weapons either, it's also down to playstyles. You can one-trick a playstyle as well, right? And I think Shock does this, where he is very consistent in doing these sort of odd jobs around the objective as opposed to just playing the objective itself. And that's seen him make a lot of highlight reel plays in this tournament, and he's won a lot of games off the back of that. And he's not like a one-trick player. He plays a lot of different weapons, but he plays the same way. Like, he understands what he's trying to accomplish. He's playing the sort of same flowchart with each of those weapons. And so when you abruptly change everything, the way Melbourne kind of did, where you've got, you've taken Goose off the Carbon, you've taken Shock off the Nort, and even I would say you've taken Psy off the Range Blaster for this particular game. Like, yeah, she top fragged, but like, there's more to the game than just there's frags, right? Like we saw in the previous game, Shock got like 13 kills, but in the crucial part of the game where Brisbane was pushing, he was absent. He was late to the party. He was cleaning up after Brisbane had already done the objective damage. And that's another kill screen. Like, again, it's not just about who has the most kills. It's when those kills happen. It's everything. It's everything outside of just the kill screen that we're looking at here. And I think going into this weekend's game, what we're looking at is Brisbane with an excellent sense of identity. They understand very well what they were trying to accomplish. And yes, we can tell, this is sort of the thing. Like, I'm saying what Brisbane's doing And you could maybe think, well, aren't I just telling Sydney how to beat them? No, Brisbane knows all the stuff that I'm saying, and they know how to handle all these shortcomings. This is what it means to be good at one of these strategies. This is what it means to have conviction in your strategy and in the way you want to win. Is you understand all the weaknesses that you have, and you are able to play and win in spite of them, right? And that's what Brisbane is. That's why Brisbane is so impressive to me. Is they've done this in a draft format. They aren't just they aren't an organized. It's one thing for an organized team to do this. It's difficult enough, but Brisbane's done this as a draft team. They are a team of 6 random players, or sort of random players, who've just kind of been thrown together, and they've actually accomplished this. Sydney, meanwhile, has actually kind of leaned into the draft format and is just playing individualistically. And that actually is going to work out for them. That has worked out for them. They're in the finals. And I'm really interested, and I think we really want to be looking at how well this sort of unit of that Brisbane has made is going to match up against this individualistic sort of playstyle that Sydney has. And regardless of who wins, I think every team, both Brisbane and Sydney, should be very pleased with how they've done. I think Melbourne had a difficult, I said last week, Melbourne's comp is hard to use. Brisbane sort of, Brisbane decided they were going to play the way they have to, the way they're playing. Melbourne kind of has to play the way they're playing because of the way their comp is set up, the way their players are set up, and they've actually leaned into it to their credit quite well. We saw Adelaide, we saw New Zealand playing a very straight up, just sort of shooter based kind of thing, and actually kind of working out. It was an easier thing to do, and so it's each team has, and Perth had some roster difficulties as well as the fact that they had a really hard comp to build, right? So Perth had a little bit of what Melbourne has, except that they had people who were really good at this kind of thing. It just didn't quite gel quickly enough to see results. But each team has confronted this idea of we're just random players. We've got to figure out how to win. So it's not as though what I'm talking about here is some foreign concept that everyone has to start from square one on. What teams have done in this tournament is effectively what I'm talking about, is to actually sit down and say, okay, here's our restrictions. How do we work within these restrictions to achieve something more? And taking that a step further is all that I'm trying to talk about, all I'm trying to say. Just taking it a step further, questioning a few more assumptions, right? Thinking a little bit harder about some of the things that you say without actually understanding what you're saying, right? And yeah, I'm really impressed with every team. Obviously Brisbane in particular, and Sydney's done quite well as well, and Melbourne's done great. But I'm impressed with every team. The way that every team has sort of leaned into all this, it's been really good to watch. And yeah, I'm very. I feel quite privileged to have been a part of this. So.
Yeah, thank you, FLC. Since we started with this, me and Checkers always knew we could bring the lols, but expert analysis was never really in our. We could point out what we saw and that kind of stuff, but it's been a hell of a ride over the last 5 weeks, 6 weeks now, running with you and kind of digging deeper into this. And where else do you get to see this? 2 hours of just dedicated to just ripping apart games, picking recurring themes and challenging everyone to be better. It's just not seen. So I thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. And the fact that you twice tonight, you guys said this on stream, shows how much we've been paying attention in these as well.
Right.
Yeah, literally twice. I just turned the stream audio on twice and I just heard these two things, and that's what I'm going to talk about.
No, it's been awesome, and thank you so much. Most importantly, the viewers. Every time you're on, you're always. I know you've all got notepads at home waiting to write this stuff down, and I hope you guys can take all of this on board. We have a bloody series that we can release now on DVD.
There you go.
Who uses DVD anymore? to be a better player. And it's not just Splatoon 2. Splatoon 2 will come and go. It might be Splatoon 3. It might be another game completely. These concepts don't shift. These ideas of positioning, these ideas of map control, these ideas of team comp, of thinking about the strategies before and after, during a game, clutch moments, all of it is the same thing, coded in a different set of mechanics. So really try and take on what you've heard here, and most importantly, join us this Sunday to see what the teams have learnt, and see if Brisbane Boom's consistent identity, like they've found themselves, can actually take out Sydney. The team of how would you? I'm trying to think of an analogy, but Cowboys are a little bit too wild and unpredictable, whereas these guys are kind of they're like a four-man wolf pack.
The sheriffs versus the desperados or something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, a little bit more constructed, but still, they roll by themselves, kind of thing.
Yep.
They're 4 lone wolves who happen to form a pack sometimes.
Yeah, cool. That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, something you just reminded me of that's really scary is there's already kids who don't know what a VHS is, but there's actually we're coming up with kids who don't know what a DVD is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know, right? And especially because no one's going to buy the PS5 with a disc drive in it. So that it's gone.
There's going to be people who don't know what a Blu-ray is even. Wow.
Oh, it'll be like Betamax. Oh god, we're just showing our age now. So good work, everyone on stream, every viewer. Thank you so much. And once again, ATAR support for giving us access to this ATAR revision. Guys, anyone out there who is in year 11, year 12, wants to get their dream ATAR rank, go to atarsupport.com.au and check out their course material there. All online, all stream on demand, every device. So thanks, everyone.
Necessary.
No what? Sorry?
No DVDs necessary.
Exactly. So thank you very much, guys, and have a great night. We'll see you this Sunday at 11 a.m. AEST for Brisbane versus Sydney in the grand final, the $1,000 money match.
See you then.
Bye.